I'm talking this afternoon to David Turner, who is an academic historian and looking at particularly at the area of disability and industrialization employment. And so we thought he'd be an ideal person to give us some background information on this whole area, which is our theme of Disability History Month 2024. So welcome, David. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and then I'll ask you the first question?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me to do this, Richard. I'm David Turner. I'm a professor of history at Swansea University. I'm also a trustee of Disability Arts Cymru. And my research and teaching is focused on the history of disabled people from the 16th century up to the present, but I've mostly been working on the 18th and 19th centuries, and I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
So really standing right back, that having been your field, could you summarize in a few points for us a general view of the treatment of disabled people, both this often seen as a big difference before Industrial Revolution and after and through it? What's your view on all of that, starting with the pre-industrial and moving through for disabled people? As you said, you've researched this whole area.
Yeah, so there is this view really that the Industrial Revolution changes things dramatically for disabled people. So before the Industrial Revolution, the view is that because people tended to work in their own homes, surrounded by their families, then they had a bit more flexibility about what they did and how fast they worked, and were able to get a bit more support. So the theory is that that made the world before industrialization more inclusive for disabled people. Doesn't mean to say that disabled people did especially well in this society, but the idea is that there's a little bit more support, and you can certainly see lots of examples of disabled people working before the age of industrialization. So we have some really interesting bits of evidence in administrative records. So from the Tudor period onwards, there's a great deal of interest in the problem of poverty. And so in towns like Norwich, which was the second city in England in the 1570s, there was an attempt to produce a census of poor people living in the city, and it revealed disabled people working often with quite significant impairments, often into quite old age. So just one example, a woman named Elizabeth Mason. She was a widow. She was 80 years old in 1570 when the census was taken, and she's described as quote, a lame woman with one hand. And of course, the usual sort of warning here about language used by people in the past. It's not these aren't terms we find acceptable today, but these are the terms used at the time. But she's just got one hand, but she's described as supporting herself through spinning and winding wool using that one hand. And we found other examples of people with physical impairments working as shoemakers. Sometimes we find people running errands. Sometimes we find them owning and running their own shops. We find them in agricultural work, which is not surprising because the vast majority of people worked in agricultural labor before the Industrial Revolution. And there were some particular trades which were associated with disabled people. So one example is tailoring. So physically disabled men and boys were often apprenticed to tailors because it's work they could do sitting down. And so you get lots of examples of of these people finding work in that particular trade. So you find physically disabled women involved in knitting, and so the emphasis was that people should work as long as they possibly could.
Mm.
And so some of the people mentioned in this Census of the Poor in 1570 are receiving some support from their local parishes, but it's not. But in many cases, it's not a complete form of support. It's to supplement their wages so that they can carry on working, but it's acknowledging that perhaps they aren't able to produce as much or to earn as much as some of their non-disabled neighbours. So there are plenty of examples then of disabled people working before the Industrial Revolution. But I don't. But as I said earlier, I don't think it's a golden age by any
Right.
means. These are people clustered in quite low-paying trades, and experiences vary enormously. So historians are, I think, looking now in more detail at the complexities of people's lives. So that's sort of the time before the Industrial Revolution. The theory with the Industrial Revolution is that, well, everybody leaves the land and goes and works in factories. And so the whole pattern of work is supposed to change, that in a factory, people have to clock on and clock off at certain times, so there's less flexibility around the hours that people work. There's more standardization, and there's and people are taken out of their homes, so they lose that supportive family cluster.
Mm.
That's a theory, at least.
Mm.
But again, in practice, it's a much more complicated situation. So I think one thing to really emphasize is that although the factory is perhaps what we always think about when we think about the Industrial
Mm.
Revolution, it's not the dominant form of work in the 19th century. So in the 1851 census, for example, about a third of the population are working in some kind of manufacturing, but only 5% of the population are working in factories. A lot of people are still working in small settings, in workshops. Um, there are examples of people still working in family groups, and so these economic changes are much more gradual. And
Mm.
so I don't think we should see the Industrial Revolution as a kind of cliff edge at which
Mm.
everything goes really badly wrong for
Mm.
disabled people. But as I think we'll talk about a bit later,
Mm.
there are ways in which life is becoming harder for disabled people as industrialization takes hold.
Okay, that's a really useful snapshot. So, what sort of cultural and social and economic barriers were disabled people up against? Because it looks like there was a fair amount of toleration, but obviously still, if we look at joke books and cartoons, there was still a good bit of stigmatization going on. But nevertheless, what would you say were the key cultural, social, and economic barriers that were disabled people were facing? Say, you mentioned the 1850 census, say around 1850.
Yeah, well, there's well, you mentioned some stereotypes about disability, and of course, there were plenty of
Mm.
negative views of disabled people, not necessarily presenting them as incapable of work. I mean, there's derogatory language. Is there are some quite nasty stereotypes used against individuals, which makes fun of their appearance and makes fun of their impairments. And these are barriers that people have to face. So it was really interesting, perhaps, is if you look at these not on a kind of sort of broad level, but actually how they affect certain individuals. And so, if I give you an example,
Mm.
um, there's a man called George Cull, who Cull, George Cull. He's born in 1840, and about 25 years later, he writes an autobiography of his early life. He is born into a military family in Woolwich, in London. And he is described, and again, I'm going to use one of those awful historical terms. He's described as deaf and dumb, so he's prelingually deaf. So he described in his early life, his family moved to Manchester when he's 4. He goes in and they find a place for him at one of the new schools for deaf children at Old Trafford in Manchester. And he stays there for 7 years. He has an absolutely wonderful time in that school. He really, really enjoys it, and he feels part of a community. He communicates primarily through sign language. He doesn't speak. And after he leaves school, he goes back to his family who've moved back down to Woolwich, and he is apprenticed to a tailor, and he struggles in that work. I've just mentioned that tailoring is seen as a kind of inclusive occupation for disabled people, but as a young deaf man, he doesn't really get on with tailoring that much, and he talks a bit about those problems. And one of the problems he does bring up is that he gets teased a lot by other apprentices on the basis of being quote deaf and dumb. So certainly he faces stigma because of his impairment, but that itself isn't always a barrier to him getting other work. So he leaves his job. He tries to find other apprenticeships. He goes off to work with other tailors. He has a go at being a carpenter for a while. Again, he comes up against prejudice, but another reason why he's moving around is because he doesn't really enjoy the work anyway. So he is sort of, he's kind of exercising a bit of agency on his own part about that. Like, the work isn't really agreeing with me. Eventually, he gets a job in the munitions factory at the Arsenal in Woolwich. And he absolutely loves this. But then one day there's an accident at work. One of the shells that they're making explodes. Several people lose their life, and he is really frightened by this. And he decides to emigrate to Canada to go to his uncle's farm just outside Toronto. And he tries farming for a while. Again, really doesn't like that very much. And eventually he ends up becoming a traveling book salesman, traveling across North America. And this autobiography he wrote a lot of it is about his adventures. So he's someone who faces prejudice, but he's also not, this often doesn't prevent him from getting work altogether. There's only one occasion where he writes about his deafness actually stopping him from getting a job, and that's when he goes down to the Chatham dockyard to try and get some work there. And the foreman says, "No, sorry, we're not going to employ a deaf person because we can't communicate with you." And Carl says, "Well, I can teach you sign language. It's not hard," but still he gets turned away. But that's the only time when he comes up against that sort of employer barrier, that suspicion, that sort of feeling that they can't accommodate him. Whereas other employers seem a lot happier, and he talks about other employers having deaf and dumb apprentices as well, and he meets lots of other deaf people. So he's part of a deaf community of people who are working in similar kinds of area. But he does, as I say, face some teasing from his co-workers, which isn't like, and very occasionally he faces outright hostility.
Because, I mean, it's often stated, and I think one of the researchers who's done most on workhouses that has looked, I think, at the 1861 census, and he suggests that the majority of people who were registered in workhouses by that time were either old or infirm, an old word for disabled. So there clearly were pressures on people to go to places like workhouses. But So were there other pressures on other disabled people that might have pushed them more in that direction, do you think?
Um, yeah, I mean, workhouses do get filled up with particularly older people. They who lack family support. So
Mm,
the law states in the 19th century very clearly that families should be stepping in to look after their older and disabled relatives. And it's where that family support breaks down that uh, that people become long-term
mm,
residents of workhouses. But disabled people are using workhouses in other ways as well. So sometimes they might use it as as a form of temporary accommodation.
mm,
Sometimes this is seasonal. So the journalist Henry Mayhew, who writes about the poor people in London, he describes a street seller um, who, because of his physical impairment, his mobility impairment, he struggles to get around the streets in winter. So he'll go into the workhouse during the winter and
mm,
then come out again in the spring
mm,
and resume his work. So
mm.
I don't think we should see workhouses sort of as just as dumping grounds,
Right,
but they're also kind of that they do have open doors. Anyone you can
right.
come and go as you want in a workhouse. Um, but yeah, that fear of the workhouse is something you find a lot in 19th century sources, and
Mm,
something which really impels people to try and work as much as they possibly
mm,
can, because of the stigma of being placed in a workhouse or having to go into a workhouse because you can't support yourself, and more importantly, even that you can't support the rest of your family. Um, so you do get people talking about that fear and sort of that's pushing themselves to work longer than they really should
mm.
be working. And it's
Right.
that's one of the most striking things I've read from that mid 19th century period. It comes up in an interview for a government royal commission into all kinds of work and from 1842, and the commissioners talk to a man in his 30s who's working in pottery in Stoke-on-Trent, which is where I'm from originally.
Mm,
So I was drawn to that example. But he says something really fascinating, and he's someone who's got lung disease, and his knee is really painful because he had an accident where he fell on top of an iron bar, and it's so he's got real pain in one of his legs, and but he carries on working, and he says, some days I work when I'm not able, because I have to. I have to feed my family. And that idea of working when not able, I think, really captures that sort of 19th century experience of disability and work, not of disabled people being sort of thrown out of work or get
mm,
excluded from the workplace, but actually trying to work when really that they should be looked after elsewhere, because and clearly for this person working in a really dusty environment like a pot bank is not going to is just going to make his health worse. And
mm.
so it's that lack of alternative that's really pushing people to work to their limits.
Okay, and sort of echoes of that in what we've been hearing this week from the Labour Party, I think that all those who are on long-term sick should go into work, but there obviously are barriers that prevent people from working then and now. Um, let's move on to the area which you've looked at most carefully, the coal fields, which I think quite interesting because they're not factories, but they are primary industry producing the raw materials, really, the biggest raw material of the Industrial Revolution, which was coal for steam power. And therefore, there was a new collectivity, which perhaps you didn't get in these smaller workshops, which was there really right from the start, from people working with each other. How do you think, first of all, in the earlier part of the coalfields, because I think you started looking at them from about 1780, how was at that time disability looked at? Both because, of course, mining is a very dangerous occupation, and therefore it creates its own range of impairments, both for sight, but also many physical things from falls and so on. And of course, many fatalities, but that's not disability, that's death. But for every fatality, I think somebody said there is probably 100 people who acquired some sort of impairment in the industry. So how was it in the early days of the mining industry with regard to people who acquired impairments, or indeed people who wanted to work there already had an impairment?
Yes, I mean, I think what you've just said, I think is a really important thing to bear in mind, and that is just how normal disability was in
Mm,
the past, and particularly in coal mining, where, as you say, there's that we tend to think about sort of mining as sort of an industry where lots of people die, which they do, but there's hundreds more who are getting who are being injured, some of which results in permanent disability, but we just don't know the numbers. But the evidence points to the to large numbers of people in that situation. So coal mining communities are used to the sight of disabled people, but and and um, and so disability is sort of part of the day-to-day working life in coal mines. So um, in terms of people getting injured in the course of their work, there does seem to be a general attitude. Again, there's some good employers and there are bad employers. So this is so we've got to be careful about sort of generalizing here. But generally speaking, there is a kind of assumption, I think, that if you are injured whilst working in the mine, then if you're able to come back to work in some capacity, then there is an attempt, I think, on the part of the employers to try and find something for you to do. Now, in some cases, that might mean going back underground. So, in our research on disability in the coal industry, we were surprised, I guess, to find references to men and boys with wooden legs working underground in mines and doing that kind of work. You certainly find men with scars or burn injuries going back underground, and sometimes these men had a kind of status because they'd survived an accident, and so sometimes they went into supervisory roles so they could advise on safety because of their own experiences. But not everybody could go back. Not everyone was uh, physically capable of that kind of heavy labor, and so for them there were a variety of jobs on the surface. I mean, a 19th century coal mine has lots and lots of different jobs there. It's not just about cutting coal, but a mine needs carpenters. It needs people to look after the animals that work there. They look after the lamps and things. And so disabled miners sometimes go into these surface roles. Some of it isn't very well paid. Some of it is quite low status because, as well as there being lots of different types of jobs, there's a real hierarchy of work in a coal mine as well. So if you're a physically strong miner who worked underground and then suddenly you're involved in an accident where where your hand gets crushed or something like that, and you can't hold a pickaxe anymore, and then you're offered a job in handing out lamps to people as they go underground. That's not very high status work. It's sometimes described as boys' work, in fact. And so it could be so again, I think we have to be careful about thinking about inclusivity here. They are inclusive in that respect, but but this isn't always high status work that people are being offered. But there is this sense that that or an expectation that disabled miners are supported in some respects, and also supported in their communities as well. So sometimes you have communities sort of having like a whip round to buy people buy disabled miners some stock or some tools so they can set up a new trade. Quite often you find disabled coal miners working as school teachers in mining villages, and um, so that is quite high status work.
Mm.
And in these government reports, it often gets mentioned because middle class
Mm.
outsiders are absolutely horrified by this. Why these sort of uneducated men being entrusted
Mm.
with children's education. But I think it's a sense that communities feel a sense of obligation towards people who've given something, through their impairments. So a chance to get them to work, and also those schools which they're teaching are full of disabled children as well.
Mm.
So in Merthyr Tydfil in early 1840s, and the school at Dowlais, which is next to one of the iron foundries in that
Mm.
town, there are 12 disabled boys on the school roll.
Mm.
Yeah, and they are there because they'd previously worked in the ironworks or in one of the coal mines. They'd been injured. Many of them were amputees, and they'd come to school to try and learn to read and write, so they could find clerical work. So they're
Yeah.
looking for
Yeah.
sort of office jobs
Mm.
at the ironworks. So so coal mining is an interesting example of this. And again, I think we've got to be careful about sort of saying, oh well, this is what it's like for every disabled person in the 19th century. If you compare it with factory work at
Mm.
the same time, there's a lot more complaint about employers not doing anything for their disabled workers, and they're just being cast off onto the poor law or to be
Mm.
supported by their families. And some of the earliest disability activism in the 1840s and 1830s and 1840s is about the conditions of maimed and so-called deformed factory
Mm.
workers, and um, trying to get a better deal for them.
Mm. So at what point, and now sort of moving on into the rest of the 19th century, but at what point do these sort of welfare arrangements get more formalized, either with friendly societies, trade unions, or in fact compensation acts, which get passed, I think, in 1880 and seem to change the situation quite a bit? So how do you look at the position for disabled people in the coalfields as we progress through the century, the 19th century?
Yeah. So, with regard to trade unions, first of all, I mean, disability is a driving force behind trade unionism.
Mm.
And so, at mass meetings in the coalfields to try and get men to join the union,
Mm.
you get speakers talking about the statistics around disability in mining. The thousands of men who are left disabled through this work, and they need, the argument is they need the union to advocate for them. Um, and so unions do play an important role, and there are disabled trade unionists, people whose experience of disability kind of draws them into union life, and they become union
Mm.
activists. There's a miner called Edward Reimer, who was, he experienced some difficult situations working as a coal miner, which resulted from his own impairment. He was
Mm.
quite badly burnt when he was a child, and he had
Mm.
visual impairment as well. And he talks about some of the brutal remarks, as he called them, that were made about um, his um, his impairments, and so that seems to kind of have sort of made him sort of realize how important unions were. And so he spent a lot of his time traveling around different collieries trying to get men to
Mm.
join the union. Friendly societies are linked in some ways to trade unions. In fact, some early friendly societies probably were effectively trade unions, and just friendly society was a way of getting around some of the laws that prevented people coming together in unions. A friendly society works a bit like modern insurance company. In fact, many of the 19th century societies became the big
Mm.
insurance companies we have today. So as a worker, you paid in part of your wages, and if you got sick, then you could draw on the Friendly Society for some financial support while you were unable to work.
Mm.
And that's great if you say break a finger
Mm.
and you're off work for 12 weeks or so
Mm.
and it heals and you go back, and that's fine. So on short, in terms of short-term support, this is a real lifeline. But if you are more permanently disabled
Mm.
and aren't able to go back to work, then um, over time the money that you get receive reduces. So usually there's a fixed term. You can only claim for 2 years, and
Mm.
so that's it. So friendly societies aren't particularly geared up for long term disabled support, although miners in the northeast of England formed their own um, um, initiative called the Miners Permanent Relief Fund, which is a joint thing between mining unions and the owners of the coal mines, which does start to fund long-term support for
Mm.
people who are disabled. So that comes in the 1860s.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, you mentioned compensation. So at the start of the 19th century, the assumption was that if you went to work in a dangerous occupation or any occupation, and you had an accident at work, then you accept that as a risk you
Mm.
take for going into that work. So even though we know that there's very high risk of of injury in coal mining, if you went to work in a mine, that was your choice, and so if anything happened to you, that's it. Um, but laws do eventually come in the 1880s. First one's called the Employers' Liability Act, and then in 1897 there is another piece of legislation called the Workmen's Compensation Act, and these get revised periodically through the early 20th century. And on the one hand, these are great for people who are injured at work, so that it does enable them to claim some financial support from their employers, particularly after the Workmen's Compensation Act. The Employers' Liability Act of 1885 had lots of made it quite difficult to claim, but it gradually becomes easier. Um, but the problem is that employers have to take out insurance to pay for this, and so um, they become increasingly risk averse when it comes to taking on anybody with a pre-existing health condition, which might make them more liable to having an accident
Mm.
in the workplace. So in 1911, I think it is, the Employers' Liability Act and Insurance um, requires that workers have a medical when they start,
Mm.
when they're taken on, and so this is used to weed out people
Mm.
with um, with any kind of health
Mm.
issue, and affects older workers as well disproportionately. And so by the time we get to the First World War,
Mm.
it's getting increasingly difficult for disabled people to fight to get work because of these measures, which are brought in, you could say, to kind of help disabled people, but
Mm.
actually it has the opposite effect,
Mm.
because people with existing conditions find it much harder to get work.
Mm. And of course, that all was turned on its head really during the First World War, when the sort of, to use a phrase, the reserve army was called up. Women, but also lots of disabled workers who, presumably under this previous act, had been deemed as not fit to work, were suddenly fit to work. And any
It's
examples of how that
it,
worked?
it's strange, that, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's so yeah, that's very much what happens. And and so I mentioned George Cull, the deaf worker who worked in the munitions factory in the
Mm.
1850s, and so during the First World War and during the Second World War, sort of deaf people were in demand in those kind of environments, which are very noisy, and so actually perhaps better suited to work in that environment than some hearing people were. So yeah, there is so First World War, and in particular the Second World War. I think the Second World War is really notable in this respect. That's
Mm.
that that that's thousands of disabled people do find work on the home front in the Second World War, and this, and then it's at that point I think that the government does sort of start to recognise that actually disabled people are having problems in the workplace and in peacetime, and so it's that experience of employing thousands of disabled people during the Second World War that eventually leads to the Disabled People's Employment Act in 1944, which has lots of problems as a piece of legislation. It brings in the quota system, which requires employers to take in a certain percentage of their workforce from people who are registered as disabled under the Employment Act. In practice, many employers evade that responsibility, or they put disabled people into very kind of low skilled, low status jobs. So it's not perfect by any means, but that wartime experience of work does, I think, have an impact in terms of legislation to try and address some of the problems facing disabled people in
And also
employment.
in that act, we see sort of the state's responsibility for rehabilitation coming in, re-employment, re-employ factories coming out of that. But clearly before that, there had been local authority sheltered workshops that did various things. When do we see this first coming in, that the public good, if you like, is served by rehabilitating people rather than just leaving them to their own devices?
Well, you have sheltered workshops in the 19th century.
Mm.
So one example of this is the Association for Promoting the General Welfare of the Blind, which is founded by Elizabeth Gilbert and William Hanks Levy in the 1850s. And they identified a real problem in that that blind children are educated in schools, so there's increasing provision for children, but then what happens to them when they enter the world of work, and that's blind, visually impaired people are finding it very, very difficult to find sustainable work, or so the association established a workshop in on the Euston Road in London, and first aimed at providing work for men, but also women as well. But it's very much a charitable initiative, so it relies on donations. It doesn't. I mean, doesn't really have an impact on policy. Although Gilbert was interested in education policy, but she wasn't. But it doesn't really have a major impact on changing the government's approach. So that leads to kind of more militant blind activism at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, through the National League of the Blind, who put a real focus on employment, and it's their activism that leads to eventually to the government taking action in 1920.
And I mean, they had a whole series of strikes, not just the march that they had in 1920, but in before the First World War, there were quite a lot of strikes in the workshops. There were municipal workshops, I think, for blind people in quite a lot of places, but they were on strike because they were not getting paid anywhere near any other workers. Was that not the case, I think?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, it's that problem of not just that disabled people find it hard to get work, but actually it's what they're paid for that work. And the National League of the Blind really put an emphasis on this pay gap and the difficulties that blind workers had just competing with non-disabled workers. But again, it's the First World War that has a major impact on rehabilitation, and the state having to get involved more in certainly in trying to address the problem of people disabled in war. And I think you do see a bit of a two-tier system emerging around that time, that there is more. I mean, the provision for disabled ex-servicemen isn't brilliant, but but they're very much a focus, not disabled civilians. And so, yeah, there was a sense, I think, during the First World War that Britain was lagging behind some of the other European countries in terms of what it was doing to try and rehabilitate war disabled servicemen and find opportunities
There
for
was
them.
particular disquiet, I think, amongst disabled ex-servicemen to see that the defeated Germans had a much better system under the Weimar Republic than we did in the UK, where we tried to rely just on a charity system rather than anything else, which perhaps, the role of charity, which you mentioned earlier, is perhaps bigger in the UK than in many other European countries. Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question, and I think it's I suppose historically, from the beginning of the 19th century, charity has played a quite prominent role in the lives of disabled people. So there is a kind of long philanthropic
Mm,
tradition. I think it goes back um, perhaps even to the beginning of welfare. So, if you go back to the Poor Law in 1601, okay, so on the face of it, this establishes something close to a legal right to
mm,
support for for certain disabled people. But but often people think about this as a form of charity. So I've done some research on petitions written by
mm,
or on behalf of disabled people in the 17th century when they're getting in touch with magistrates in their local communities because they feel that they're not getting the kind of support that they need. And these petitions, although there's a law they can appeal to, they very rarely talk about the law. They talk about the compassion of the magistrates, and that they appeal to their Christianity and their good
mm,
nature and their duty to their sort of more moral obligation. So it's kind of an articulation of the moral rights of disabled
mm,
people rather than the social rights or the legal rights. And I think that sort of runs quite deep. And so eventually in the 19th century, you get all these kinds of charities
mm,
who are taking an interest in the condition of disabled people, and
mm.
I think it just allows the state to ignore this as a
I,
problem as for a long time.
I suppose one of the ways of generating that money was the parish collections, which went into the parish pool, also linked it directly with a religious activity rather than a state activity as such, even though, as you say, it was administered by the magistrates. So,
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, because the parish is the
mm,
unit of administration, and the parish, what's at the center of the parish, the church. It's
mm,
very much framed in that kind of
mm,
Christian charity
mm,
model, even though it's a legal obligation for people who can afford it to contribute to the parish poor rate. It's not a voluntary charitable donation. It is a legal requirement, but it's framed in terms of charity, and so people have to think about it in those terms.
So we've talked about industrialization, we've talked about war, we've talked about slow changes. One of the big things that happened from about 1880 on was of course the growth of eugenics, and that had a separate impact really on particular groups of workers, those who were sort of slow-witted or didn't think as quick as other people, people who've been labeled as idiots or imbeciles, but also feeble-minded, of which there were many people all around the population.
Hmm.
How do we see that impacting on workers as such? Were people being rejected because of those ideas as well?
I think increasingly that was the case.
Mm,
I think if you go back to the 18th century and for quite a large part of the 19th century, you do find people with what we would now see as learning disabilities in the
mm,
workplace.
mm,
So again, going back to this government commission in the early 1840s, which is just such a rich record
mm,
of disabled people's work in the Swansea pottery. There is a man working there who's described as, I quote, an imbecile.
mm,
And So he's there. He's glazing pots, and someone, he doesn't actually speak himself in this, but one of his co-workers, say, "Oh, well, no one can really remember, if he was like this when he started work, or whether this is an effect of his work. But there's no sense that he's an outcast in that workplace at all. He's just one of the team, and so but by the end of the 19th century, things are changing, and so there's much greater institutionalization of people uh, with learning disabilities from the mid 19th century onwards, and um, then these people are really at the sharp end of eugenics. From the 1880s onwards, really, that they are seen as a dangerous population who do need to be kept away from the rest of society.
Yeah, I seem to remember a paper in Disability in Society that looked at parish registers in Wales and came up with, that in the 1830s there were lots of mentions of village, quote, idiot, but by the 1880s they'd all seem to have disappeared. So perhaps that's some concrete evidence of this shift away from being in society to being somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think we tend to we do, goes back to the point I've been making, I think, throughout, really, that we do tend to think about, sometimes think about sort of what was life like for disabled people, but there's such a lot of differentiation
Yeah.
between different constituencies, and I think the experience of people with learning disabilities is quite different, in the sense that the eugenic thought and eventually policy through like the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act is very much targeted towards them. Lots of, wider constituency of people got incarcerated institutions under the Mental Deficiency Act, but that's real focus on the so-called feeble-minded, as shows, I think, some of the differences in the way in which people are treated, and some people were life wasn't great for most disabled people in the past, but it was considerably worse for some people.
Yes, so we've talked for a long time, so I don't want to keep you too long, and I want you to do your summary bit. But just to wind up, why do you think it's important that historians engage themselves in this history? What does it bring to our present understanding of disability?
I think it helps us to understand disabled people in the past, as people. I mean, that sounds like a simple thing to say, but I think when you start to uncover these individual histories, like going back and reading George Cull's autobiography, you get a real sense of some of the challenges of being deaf in the middle of the 19th century. I think it also gets us to think about about disabled people's experiences of work more generally. And one of the it's quite it's difficult, when you consider some of the current political issues. You mentioned earlier, this political drive to get disabled people into work, and from both sides of the political spectrum, really. And so when you sort of look at the past, and you look at the 19th century, and you see so lots of disabled people in work, I mean, it's what I'm not trying to do is sort of say, well, disabled people have always worked, so they can go off and work now. Look, there's a guy working in a coal mine with a wooden leg, so get off your sofa and get out to work. That's not the message I really want to get across from this, because the guy working underground with a wooden leg is there because he's really scared of the consequences of not working, and he's and so I think that so while it's I think we must recognize that disabled people have always worked, and that disabled people make a valuable contribution to the world of work. So the coal miner with the wooden leg, he is driving economic change in the 19th century, through his labor. And so disabled people are part of part of that bigger economic history and shouldn't be excluded from that. Um, but at the same time, we need to also think about the history of people who can't work, don't work, and those histories are really important as well. And yeah, let's recognize the things that disabled people have done. Let's write them back into the history books, or write them back into that story of industrialization, because they were there, they were working, they were organizing, they were joining unions, they were speaking out about conditions in the workplace. So let's recognize that. Let's celebrate that involvement, but let's also kind of use this to have a conversation about the real difficulties that disabled people face in the workplace then and face in the workplace today.
No, and the work as such has changed. I mean, with the IT revolution and so on, you don't need to have physical mobility to hold down a really important job. If you can move any part of your body to interact with the internet, whether it's eye pointing or head pointing and so on. So we have much wider range of roles, but some of the prejudice which was developed in the 19th and early 20th century is still there, I think, against employing people who function differently. And this is particularly what we see with people with mental health issues, people with neurodiverse. There's a real holding back from employers that they're not sure that these are the people they should be taking on. And I suppose from my point of view, we mine disability history of the past to try and challenge people's thinking today and into the future. So that would be one I would add to it. Anyway, David, that's been brilliant. Let's thanks for all of that.